There is a truth narcissists never say out loud, yet live in constant fear of: the fear of encountering someone they cannot control, not someone stronger than them, not someone more intelligent than them, but someone who no longer reacts in the way they need. Carl Jung emphasized that no one can become whole without daring to confront their own shadow. But for the narcissist, that encounter rarely happens, because beneath the confident, charming, persuasive exterior often lies an empty inner core, propped up by attention, control, and the emotional reactions of others. They exist by borrowing your emotions to feel that they are real, until they meet someone with deep empathic capacity, someone who does not merely feel emotions, but sees through the mask, someone who is not pulled into drama, not led by guilt, fear, or moral obligation. And in that very moment, the power game begins to crack. This is not simply a conflict between two personality types. This is an illusion confronting truth, an ego built from external reflection colliding with a self that already has an inner axis, manipulation running headfirst into awareness. In this video, we will walk together through 8 harsh truths that explain why narcissists always regret confronting someone with extraordinary empathic depth. But more importantly, you will not only come to understand them, you will begin to recognize the quiet power you yourself already possess, the power of no longer needing to fight to exist, and no longer having to lose yourself to be loved. 1. Regret for no longer being able to control your emotions. There is a very small moment, easy to overlook, but once you have lived through it, you never forget it. It is the moment when someone says something that would normally be enough to make you angry, push you to explain yourself, or at least cause a sharp sting inside. But this time, you do nothing. You do not argue. You do not defend yourself. You do not feel the need to prove anything. You simply look at them, or remain silent, or respond briefly and calmly. And in that instant, you see their eyes change. Not immediate anger, but something deeper: confusion, a sense of loss, even a fleeting trace of fear. That brief moment becomes the starting point of the narcissist's greatest regret, because throughout the relationship, the one thing they never questioned was their ability to control your emotions. They did not need formal authority or explicit commands. All it took was a well-timed, sarcastic remark, a deliberate silence, or a cold look when you said something they disliked. And you reacted. You explained. You worried. You tried to fix things. Each time, they knew one thing with absolute certainty: they still occupied the center of your emotional world. Narcissists do not live on deep connection. They live on reactions. Your reactions are the measurement of their existence. When you feel sad because of them, angry because of them, anxious because of them, or even compelled to prove yourself to them, all of it carries the same unconscious message: you matter enough that I have to change my inner state because of you. And, for a narcissist, there is no validation more powerful than that. You can see this clearly if you look back at past conflicts. After a long argument, you feel completely drained, your mind spinning, your chest heavy. And them, they may still be talking, still sharp, even seeming energized. This is not a coincidence. While your energy is being depleted, theirs is being replenished. Every intense emotion you express becomes fuel for their fragile ego. Carl Jung once wrote, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the whole personality." When the ego is disconnected from the deeper layers of the self, it must rely on external signals to feel real. For narcissists, other people's emotions become those signals. They do not need you to love them in any profound sense. They only need you to react to them. That is why they learn very quickly how to trigger you. They know where your vulnerabilities lie. They know what you are sensitive to. They know when a sentence will make you doubt yourself, and when silence will send you into panic. It is not always a calculated act of cruelty. Sometimes it is simply a psychological reflex formed over a long time. But whether conscious or unconscious, the outcome is the same. You are pulled into their emotional vortex. What is most striking is that during this phase, you often do not realize you are being controlled. You believe you are working through issues, trying to make the relationship better, or being honest with your feelings. Slowly, however, you begin to notice that you are always the more tense one, the more exhausted one, the one who thinks the most. You start mentally preparing before every interaction. You weigh every sentence. You ask yourself, Will this upset them? And without realizing it, the very moment you ask that question, the balance of power has already shifted completely to one side. Then, quietly, something inside you changes. Not because you become angrier, but because you become tired. Tired of explaining, tired of needing to be understood by that particular person. Maybe it happens after too many times your words are twisted. Maybe after too many familiar loops, or maybe you simply begin to trust your own inner sense more than what they say. And so, for the first time, you do not react the way they expect. You do not flare up when provoked. You do not explain when misunderstood. You do not rush to soothe their emotions when they show discomfort. You remain polite, calm, but there is now a very clear distance. Not cold, not retaliatory, just no longer pulled in. For you, this may feel like relief, but for the narcissist, it is a shock, because for the first time, they cannot read you. They do not know whether their words worked or not. They are unsure whether you are hurt, angry, or indifferent. That uncertainty disorients them. Without your reaction, they no longer know where they stand in your inner world, and that strikes directly at their deepest fear, being rendered ineffective. Carl Jung once observed, "People with a weak ego cannot tolerate ambiguity. Ambiguity is something narcissists cannot endure. When you stop reacting, you create a void, and within that void, they no longer know whether they still hold power. They begin to test again, speaking more harshly, becoming more sarcastic, or suddenly turning gentle to pull you back in. But if you remain steady, they will feel it clearly. The old tools no longer work." Someone once told me that the moment they decided to leave a relationship was not when they were hurt the most, but when they realized they no longer wanted to react. "I heard them speak, but there was nothing left in me to answer," they said, "and I saw them panic, as if they had just lost something very important. That something was not love, it was control." You might wonder, so, is silence and non-reaction just avoidance? Not quite. Avoidance is when you are silent because you are afraid. This is different. This is silence because you no longer see any reason to participate in a cycle that harms you. The difference lies in how it feels inside. If silence makes you shrink and feel anxious, that is avoidance. But if silence makes you breathe easier and feel clearer, that is the reclaiming of energy. In Jungian terms, this is the moment you stop projecting your psychological energy onto another person. You no longer give them the authority to shape your emotions. You take that energy back for yourself. And when that happens, the narcissist loses their most essential source of nourishment. That is why, later on, when they look back, many narcissists regret not because they hurt you, but because they pushed you to the point where you no longer reacted. As long as you argued, felt hurt, or tried to prove yourself, they still had a place. But when you calmly stepped away, without resentment, without needing to win or lose, they were left alone with themselves. So, what should you do if you find yourself at this threshold? You do not need declarations or long explanations. Simply allow your reactions to slow down. Observe what happens when you do not immediately respond. When you stop rushing to repair other people's emotions, when you prioritize your own inner peace over keeping the harmony. And remember this, you do not lose power when you stop reacting. You are simply reclaiming what was always yours. Narcissists may never say it out loud, but deep down, they know it very well. That is exactly what they regret most when they choose to confront someone with deep, empathic capacity, someone who has finally learned how to keep their emotions for themselves. 2. Regret for having to blame you in order to avoid themselves. There is a very strange moment in exhausting relationships. Not when the arguments are explosive, not when they raise their voice or walk away, but when you sit alone afterward, replay the conversation in your mind, and suddenly wonder, wait, what did I actually do wrong? There is no clear evidence, no sentence that is truly harsh. And yet, after that conversation, you feel smaller, more at fault, and with a vague sense that you should apologize even though you cannot clearly name what for. Not every accusation is really about you. Some accusations are simply the speaker's fear, thrown onto you, so they do not have to look back at themselves. Narcissists are extremely skilled at this. They do not say, "I feel insecure." They say, "You're cold." They do not say, "I need control." They say, "You're manipulative." They do not say, "I'm afraid of being abandoned." They say, "You're careless." And they say these things with such certainty that you begin to doubt yourself. Pay attention to how they accuse, not with genuine emotional pain or vulnerability, but with a cold, decisive tone, as if they have just exposed an obvious truth about who you are. No long debate. No listening to your response, just labeling. And when a label is applied often enough, you start to wonder whether it might be true. You begin to review your every action. Am I really selfish? Do I talk too much about my feelings? Am I not caring enough? Am I asking for too much? You turn inward to fix yourself. You become gentler, quieter. You try even harder to understand them. Not because you truly believe you are wrong, but because you fear losing the relationship if you do not become better. And that is precisely the moment when the narcissist begins to lose control, even if they have not realized it yet. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But narcissists do not use irritation to understand themselves. They use it to push outward. What they cannot bear to face within selfishness, emptiness, the lack of genuine empathy is placed onto your shoulders. In Jungian psychology, this is called shadow projection. But you do not need to remember the term. You only need to remember this very human feeling. You leave a conversation feeling as if you are carrying something that does not belong to you. A strange, heavy feeling that sits in the wrong place. Imagine someone who constantly demands your attention, your validation, your presence. But when you are tired, when you need space, when you no longer have the energy to keep being there for them, they do not say, "I'm afraid of being abandoned." They say, "You've changed. Est." And you start apologizing for needing rest. Or you are the one who always listens, always checks in, always tries to understand their feelings. But the one time you do not respond strongly enough, do not comfort them in exactly the right way, they say, "You're so cold," and you begin to doubt your own capacity for empathy. What makes narcissists regret confronting someone with deep empathic capacity is not that you argue back. It is that, eventually, you stop accepting what does not belong to you, even if it takes a long time. At first, you may accept it, you may carry it, you may blame yourself, but someone with deep empathy is not weak. They have a finely tuned sense for subtle misalignment. At some point, an accusation no longer matches your inner experience. You begin to notice a clear contradiction. What they say about you does not align with how you live, how you love, how you treat other people. You realize you are not uncaring toward the whole world, only uncaring toward them when you stop meeting their endless needs. And that is the most dangerous moment for a narcissist. Because if you no longer believe the accusation, they are forced to face the question they have always avoided. If it's not your fault, then whose fault is it? And they cannot tolerate the answer. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Blaming you allows them to keep avoiding that confrontation. But when you stop accepting the blame, this defense mechanism begins to crack. You do not need to argue for this to happen. You do not need to prove that you are right. In fact, the more you try to prove yourself, the more you are pulled back into their cycle of projection. What truly destabilizes them is when you simply listen and no longer believe. Notice their reaction when you say something very simple like, "I don't see myself that way," or when you say nothing at all. Maintaining a calm, non-defensive presence. They will become irritated. They will escalate. They will push harder with accusations. Because if they cannot push their shadow onto you, they are forced to hold it themselves. Your emotions during this phase are often mixed, relief and fear at the same time. Relief, because a part of you knows you are not crazy. Fear, because you sense the relationship is entering a different state, one where you no longer play the role of carrying their emotions for them. And that role is ending. The solution here is not confrontation, not counter-accusation, not saying, "You're the one who is like that." Doing so only swaps places in the same old script. The real solution lies in a very quiet but powerful question. Is this my emotion, or theirs? Each time you are accused, pause. Do not react immediately. Do not apologize immediately. Do not rush to fix yourself. Simply observe. Does this emotion truly fit my lived experience? Do I see myself this way in other relationships? Or do I only become the problem when I am with this person? When you do this long enough, the narcissist begins to regret. Not because they suddenly realize they were wrong, but because they realize you are no longer a container for their shadow. You are no longer the distorted mirror that helps them avoid themselves. And when they no longer have a place to dump the parts of themselves they hate most, they are forced to face them. That experience terrifies them more than any breakup ever could. When you do not take on another person's shadow, you preserve your own light. Not a dramatic light, not something to prove anything, but a very quiet light. The kind that helps you see clearly who you are and who you are not. And that is precisely what narcissists regret most when they choose to confront someone with extraordinary empathic capacity. Because you do not defeat them, you simply stop carrying what they never had the courage to carry alone. 3. Narcissists exist through drama and conflict. If a relationship only feels alive when there is drama, then it is not connection, it is emotional addiction. A healthy relationship does not need noise to exist. It still lives, still breathes, still has depth, even in quiet days. But if you pay close attention, there are relationships that only feel like they exist when everything is tense. When there are arguments, sulking, misunderstandings, tears, breakups, and reconciliations. When the drama ends, there is emptiness. When things are peaceful, there is boredom. And if a relationship can only survive on waves like that, then chances are you are not connecting with a person, but being pulled into an emotional addiction. Narcissists do not need conflict because they hate peace. They need conflict because it is the only way they feel alive. When there is no drama, they do not know what to do with themselves. When everything is stable, they become restless, irritated, empty. And because they cannot tolerate that silence, they have to create an event, something to pull you into it with them. You can see this pattern clearly if you look back at the relationship as a whole. Crises always appear suddenly, often triggered by very small things. A delayed text reply, a look that is not warm enough, an offhand comment. From there, everything gets inflated into a moral issue, into betrayal, into proof that you are not the same anymore. Yesterday they idealized you. Today, they devalue you without mercy. When they need you, you are the only one who understands them. When you need them, they disappear or turn cold, punishing. This rhythm repeats so often that you can no longer tell what is genuine emotion and what is scripted performance. And what about your emotions? You live in a state of prolonged background tension. There may not always be major arguments, but there is a constant, vague sense of anticipation. You begin to monitor every small change in their tone, every punctuation mark in their messages, every moment of silence that lasts a little too long. You learn to read the room instead of listening to yourself. And the most dangerous part is this. Even when you are exhausted, even when you are drained, you still cannot break away, because after every crisis, there is always an intense reconciliation phase where they become gentle and close again, making you believe that this time might be different. Carl Jung once wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." When the inner world is not strong enough to face emptiness, people create chaos to feel that they still exist. For narcissists, conflict is not the problem. It is the temporary solution to the deep emptiness inside them. Instead of sitting with that hollow feeling, they push it outward, turning it into a battle, a tragedy, an emotional drama, in which you are unwillingly cast as a supporting character. You will notice that problems in this relationship are rarely handled simply. A small misunderstanding is never explained cleanly. It has to be dug into, tied to the past, connected to, "You're always like this. You've never once." Emotions are not soothed, they are stirred up. And strangely, after you cry, after you panic, after you exhaust yourself trying to explain, they calm down again, sometimes even seeming relieved. You are drained, while they appear recharged. Jung described this phenomenon as psychological contagion. An unrecognized inner chaos seeks to spread into the surrounding environment in order to relieve internal pressure. Narcissists are masters at this. They do not need to say, "I'm confused." They only need to create a crisis and let you carry the emotional weight for them. You become anxious, they feel lighter. You become unstable, they regain balance. And this cycle continues until you are depleted. Try to remember, how many times did something very small turn into a life or death issue? How many times did you find yourself apologizing for something you did not even fully understand? How many times did you feel like you were living inside a long-running television drama, where every episode has a climax, but none of them offer real peace? There is an important question here, and I want you to pause and be honest with yourself. Have you ever felt so tired that you no longer had the energy to explain, yet still could not walk away? Not because you loved more, but because you had become accustomed to that emotional up-and-down rhythm. Peace started to feel unfamiliar. Quiet made you anxious. And that is the sign that you are no longer in a relationship, you are inside a dramatic system. This is where narcissists begin to regret confronting someone with extraordinary empathic capacity, because at a certain point, the empath stops playing the role. They no longer react according to the script. A crisis is thrown out, but no one panics. A provocation is launched, but no one catches it. And suddenly, the play falls out of rhythm. The solution here is not to try to make the relationship less dramatic. That does not work. Drama is not an accident. It is fuel. The only way to dismantle a play is to leave the role. No announcements. No long explanations. Simply stop emotionally performing. Stop chasing the sense of urgency they create. Stop letting everything be inflated beyond reality. You will notice something strange when you do this. At first, they will intensify the drama. The conflicts grow louder, the words harsher, the emotions more extreme. This is the reflex of someone who is about to lose their lifeline. But if you remain calm and refuse to play the role, eventually the play will die. No actors, no audience, no emotional energy to sustain it. The drama collapses on its own. And this is what narcissists regret most deeply. Not that they lost you, but that they lost the stage. They lost the place to dump their chaos. They lost the person who carried their emotions for them. Your peace, the thing that once seemed weakest, becomes the most powerful force that destroys the drama. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Narcissists cannot tolerate being alone with their inner emptiness. And when you no longer create conflict with them, they are forced to face themselves. That is where regret begins. And for you, when the drama fades, what appears? First, emptiness. Then, rest after exhaustion. Then something very unfamiliar. Peace no longer feels frightening. You begin to realize that a relationship without turbulence is the one that is real. And you were never meant to be an actor in someone else's tragedy. Your peace is not avoidance. It is a mature choice. And when you choose peace, the play has nowhere left to live. 4. Regret, because you set boundaries and no longer apologize. Someone without boundaries will see your boundaries as betrayal. There is a very small moment, but one powerful enough to completely shift the balance of power in a relationship. Not when you fight back, not when you argue, and not even when you walk away, but when you calmly say no and do not apologize for it. To a psychologically healthy person, this is simply a mature act, but to a narcissist, that moment feels like an unforgivable act of betrayal, because in their world, your boundaries were never seen as a right, they were seen as a threat. A person who truly has no boundaries will experience other people's boundaries as a personal attack, not because those boundaries harm them, but because they break an unspoken assumption that you exist to adjust yourself to their emotions, needs, and desires. For a long time, you may have unconsciously played the role of the easy-going one, the one who yields, the one who apologizes first to keep the peace, and then one day, very quietly, you stop. You do not over-explain. You do not accuse. You simply say, "I'm not comfortable with this." And what makes the narcissist regret is not the refusal itself, but the fact that you no longer see yourself as the one who is wrong. Look closely at how they react when boundaries appear. At first, it is often charm. They become softer, sweeter, reminding you of old memories, of how we used to be so happy. If you still hold the boundary, they shift to guilt. You are labeled cold, uncaring, selfish, changed. And if none of that works, anger appears. Not anger because they were refused, but anger because their unconditional access to you has been cut off. Your boundary exposes a truth they cannot tolerate. You are an independent person, not an extension of them. On your side, the emotional experience is complex. The first time you hold a boundary, you do not immediately feel strong. You feel guilty. A familiar voice appears in your mind. Am I being too much? Maybe I should apologize just to keep things smooth. Why do I feel so cruel? That feeling does not come from the boundary itself, but from how long you have been accustomed to sacrificing boundaries. When you are used to erasing yourself to maintain harmony, any act of self-protection can feel like wrongdoing. Here, Carl Jung touches on a crucial principle of psychological maturity. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming yourself is not a comfortable journey. It often comes with loss, the loss of relationships that only existed because you had no boundaries. The process Jung called individuation is not about becoming selfish, but about separating from false identifications in order to live in alignment with your inner nature." And the irony is this: narcissists cannot tolerate this process because they have never completed it within themselves. Narcissists do not have a stable inner self. They rely on other people's reactions, adjustments, and self-erasure to feel that they exist. When you set boundaries, you are not just saying no to a request, you are saying no to the entire power structure they have depended on. That is why they often reinterpret your boundaries as, "You've changed. You're not the same anymore. You've become heartless." Not because you truly are, but because you are no longer easy to control. You can see this clearly in everyday situations. You decline a late-night call because you need rest. The response is not respect, but, "You were never like this before." You do not want to re-explain something that is already clear. They say, "You're different now." You do not apologize for not doing what they want, and the atmosphere immediately becomes heavy. What they are mourning is not closeness. It is the time when you were willing to ignore your own feelings to keep them comfortable. At a deeper level, boundaries activate a primitive fear in narcissists, the fear of separation. Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." Narcissists do not truly know how to connect at an authentic level, so when boundaries appear, they do not experience them as healthy, they experience them as abandonment. But instead of facing that fear, they turn it into anger, blame, manipulation. Your boundary forces them to face the inner emptiness they previously concealed with power and control. There is a subtle point you may have noticed. Since you set boundaries, you no longer apologize for things that are not your fault. You do not apologize for needing space. You do not apologize for not responding immediately. You do not apologize for not wanting to argue. To a narcissist, this is a shock, because your apologies used to be proof that they were right, that they had the authority to judge, that you needed fixing. When the apologies disappear, that entire structure collapses, and that is why they regret it, not because they lost you, but because they lost the privilege of crossing your boundaries without consequence. And what about you? Have you ever felt guilty simply for holding very basic boundaries? Have you ever thought that if you explained a little more, softened a little more, apologized just once, everything would be fine? If so, pause here for a moment and ask yourself, does this guilt come from the present or from years of being loved conditionally? The practical solution is not to explain your boundaries better, more gently, or more persuasively. Because a boundary is not an argument, it is a statement. You do not need someone else to understand it for it to be valid. You only need to keep it. No defensiveness, no justification, no apology. When you do this, what happens becomes very clear. Healthy people adjust, narcissists erupt, and that reaction alone is the answer. The part that makes narcissists regret the most is this: your boundaries remove them from the center, no longer unconditionally prioritized, no longer endlessly accommodated, no longer automatically forgiven. And when you stand firmly in those boundaries without noise, without drama, without apology, you send a powerful message without saying a word. I respect myself. In the end, boundaries are not walls meant to push others away. They are the outer shape of self-respect. And when self-respect appears, relationships that survive only through intrusion naturally withdraw. Narcissists regret not because you left, but because you stayed with yourself. 5. Regret because they lose the right to rewrite the story. Whoever controls the story controls reality, not through force, not through truth, but by deciding what gets told, what gets distorted, and who is to blame in the final version. In every relationship with a narcissist, there is always a hidden war that you are never informed about in advance. It is not a war over who is right or wrong, but a war over who gets to define what actually happened. And for a very long time, you may not even realize when you stepped into that war. You only know that, over time, you become increasingly exhausted, not because the relationship is too complicated, but because the reality around you becomes more and more vague, slippery, and lacking any solid ground to stand on. Narcissists do not control you with their fists. They control you with stories. They retell events in ways that benefit them, over and over again, with absolute certainty in their tone. They edit details, reverse cause and effect, add motives you never had, and erase their own actions. At first, you react, you explain, you try to remember accurately, you bring evidence. But the more you speak, the more you feel yourself falling into a maze. Because this is not a dialogue in search of truth. It is a deliberate process of reconstructing reality. Gaslighting is not about lying once. Gaslighting is about making you doubt your own perception and memory. They do not need to completely deny what happened. They only need to say, "You're remembering it wrong. I didn't say that. You're too sensitive. It's not as serious as you think." These statements, taken individually, are very hard to refute. But when they appear repeatedly, across many contexts, with the same goal, they begin to erode your psychological foundation. The emotional impact on the person enduring this process does not explode immediately. It smolders. You begin to wonder, am I really too tense? Am I misinterpreting things? Am I making a big deal out of nothing? And then one day, you realize that you no longer trust your own memory. You remember being hurt, but you are no longer sure why. You remember crying, but you are not sure whether you had a valid reason. The feeling of, "I'm going crazy," does not come from weakness, but from reality being repeatedly pulled off its familiar axis. Carl Jung once wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." When a person can no longer distinguish between external reality and internal emotion, when all opposites are blended together to serve the ego, true consciousness cannot form. Narcissists cannot tolerate the coexistence of two things at once, that they might be wrong and that you might be right. So they must erase the opposition. And the easiest way to do that is to rewrite the story until only one version remains theirs. You can see this clearly in relationships where, after every conflict, the story is retold in multiple versions, yet with one constant. They always occupy the position of being reasonable, misunderstood, or forced to act that way. Your actions are stripped of context. Your boundaries are labeled as attacks. Your self-protective reactions are labeled as aggression. And if you try to correct the story, they say you are bringing up the past, unable to let go, or intentionally making things worse. At this point, many people fall into an exhausting loop, arguing over reality. You do not argue because you enjoy conflict, but because you need something to hold on to in order to feel grounded. But every time you argue, you are pulled deeper into their arena. Because narcissists do not need you to lose. They only need you to keep playing. When you argue, you implicitly acknowledge that reality is still negotiable, and that is the power they live on. The moment that makes narcissists begin to regret is not when you expose them, not when you win the argument, but when you stop participating in rewriting the story with them, when you stop trying to convince them that you remember correctly, when you stop needing them to validate that your feelings are legitimate, when you hold your reality without requiring their agreement. Psychologically, this is a powerful rupture, because the entire control system of a narcissist depends on their ability to influence how others interpret events. When you withdraw from that process, they lose the ability to shape shared reality. And this creates a void they do not know how to fill. They may speak badly about you to others. They may construct a new narrative, but they no longer control the reality inside you. You may notice a very subtle shift within yourself at that point. You no longer feel the need to prove anything. You no longer write long messages, explaining every detail. You no longer revisit old conversations to check whether you remembered incorrectly. You know what happened, and that is enough. This calm does not come from having won. It comes from no longer placing your self-worth in being correctly understood by someone who needs to misunderstand in order to survive. Have you ever felt exhausted from having to argue over reality? Not because you do not know the truth, but because you have had to defend it so many times? If the answer is yes, it is very likely that you have been in a relationship where the right to write the story never belonged to you. The solution here is not to speak louder or sharper. It is so simple that many people find it hard to believe. Stop arguing. Not because you are wrong, but because you no longer need to participate. Hold your reality. Rewrite your own story in silence. When they say, "It wasn't like that," you do not need to counter. You only need to know, "I know what I experienced," and that is enough. The closing message of this section is not a call to confrontation. It is a reminder of freedom. You do not need to control their story in order to live truthfully. You do not need to correct their memory to heal your own. When you stop allowing others to write your reality for you, their power ends right there. And that is exactly what makes narcissists regret, not because they are exposed, but because they no longer have a place in your story. 6. Regret, because your silence is stronger than any counterattack. Not all silence is the same. There are kinds of silence that make others tremble. There are kinds of silence that drive others mad. And there is one kind of silence that you only enter after you are truly exhausted from explaining, from arguing, from trying to be understood. That is not the silence of avoidance. It is the silence of an ending. In relationships with narcissists, silence is always dangerous territory. But dangerous for whom is an entirely different matter. Narcissists also use silence, but their silence carries the scent of punishment. They disappear to make you worry. They cut off contact to make you panic. They do not respond so that you blame yourself. That silence is not calm at all. It is loud, tense, and threatening. It forces you to ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Should I apologize? Am I about to be abandoned? It is a deliberate silence, used as a tool of emotional manipulation. Your silence, however, is different. At first, even you are not sure what it is. It does not come from a desire to retaliate. It does not come from strategy. It comes after countless times of speaking without being heard, explaining without being understood, reacting only to make things worse. It comes from a very honest moment. You no longer have the energy to continue, and for the first time, instead of trying to fix the relationship, you choose to stop in order to preserve yourself. From the outside, this behavior may look like silence, but psychologically, it is a complete withdrawal. You do not withdraw to hurt them. You withdraw because you have realized that any further words no longer have value. You do not try to prove anything. You do not try to argue back. You do not try to win. You simply no longer want to participate. Your emotional state during this phase is very distinctive. At first, there is anxiety. You are used to reacting. You are used to explaining. When you become silent, your nervous system does not yet trust that you are allowed to stop. You may feel restless. You may feel guilty. You may wonder, am I going too far? But then, very slowly, another feeling appears. Light, empty, and breathable. You are no longer pulled into meaningless dialogues. You no longer have to guess the other person's mood. You no longer have to prepare responses in your head. Your inner space begins to expand. This is the point where the narcissist begins to panic, even if they cannot name the feeling, because they realize something very dangerous to them. You are no longer reacting, not weakly, not strongly, but not reacting at all. Provocations no longer create waves. Sarcasm no longer echoes. Jabs no longer find a target. They speak, but nothing comes back. And in the psychological world of a narcissist, this is a serious malfunction. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist persists." Narcissists live on opposition. They need feedback to feel that they exist. When you counterattack, they have an opponent. When you suffer, they have proof of power. When you explain, they have a stage. But when you become silent in this way, you are not resisting them. You are simply no longer there, and that is something they cannot process. On an unconscious level, what is happening is that you are reclaiming the energy you once projected outward. Throughout the relationship, a great deal of your life energy was spent reading them, soothing them, understanding them, and adjusting yourself to fit them. When you become silent and withdraw, that energy returns. There is no noise, no climax, but the impact is deep. You begin to feel that you are regaining control over the rhythm of your own life. A very ordinary example is when they send you a provocative message, a baiting comment, or a familiar accusation. In the past, you would spend hours thinking about how to respond. Should you be gentle or firm? Should you explain or stay silent? But now, you read it, and you no longer want to reply. not because you are trying to appear superior, but because within you, the motivation to react is gone. The feeling is very clear. Replying, or not replying, no longer matters. This is exactly what makes narcissists deeply regretful. Not because you defeat them, but because you render them ineffective. Every tool they once used loses its power. Their punishing silence no longer frightens you. Their provocations no longer pull you in. And they begin to realize a difficult truth. Their power only exists when you participate. Have you ever experienced this? One day, you realize that saying nothing feels far more breathable. Not because the problem has disappeared, but because you are no longer carrying it inside yourself. That is the sign that you are leaving the emotional vortex that once pulled you in. The solution here is not to turn silence into a new weapon. Silence is not for retaliation. Silence is not for proving anything. Silence, in this case, is a conscious choice. Choosing yourself. Choosing mental health. Choosing not to continue participating in interactions that drain you. You do not need to announce it. You do not need to explain. You only need to hold that silence as a safe space for yourself. The closing message of this section is simple but powerful. Silence at the right moment is a declaration of freedom. Not freedom from the other person, but freedom from the need to react in order to be validated. When you are no longer pulled in, the narcissist loses what they fear most: the ability to affect your inner world. And that is why, in your silence, they do not hear weakness. They only hear an ending. 7. Regret. Because, for the first time, they see themselves as powerless. When every tool fails, the true nature is revealed. Not through gentle words, not through kindness, but through the moment they realize there is no longer any way to control you. No trick still works. No button on your emotions remains for them to press. And it is precisely in that moment that the narcissist touches an experience they have spent a lifetime avoiding: the feeling of powerlessness. Throughout the relationship, you may have seen them as very skilled at twisting situations, skilled at shifting blame, skilled at making you doubt yourself, skilled at making you feel both angry and compassionate, both wanting to leave and wanting to stay. You may have thought, why does this person always seem to have the upper hand? But the truth is, that power never came from real strength. It came from the fact that you were still reacting. When that reaction disappears, the entire structure of power they built begins to shake. This process is not gentle. It usually follows a very characteristic sequence. First comes escalation. When familiar tactics no longer work, they do not think they are wrong. They think they are not strong enough yet, so they increase the intensity. Words become sharper, attitudes more aggressive. They demand more, control more, and intrude deeper into your boundaries. In their mind, this is just a test that needs to be passed. They believe you will eventually return to your old position. But when escalation still fails to produce a reaction, the next phase appears: panic. This is not loud panic. It is an internal disorientation. They begin to lose their bearings. Things that once felt certain no longer are. You do not argue. You do not explain. You do not try to prove anything. And that breaks the entire psychological map they use to navigate the world. In this moment, you may see them shift rapidly, at times unusually kind, at times suddenly vulnerable, at times playing the victim. When panic is not soothed by your reaction, it turns into rage. This is the stage that shocks many highly empathic people the most, because the person in front of you no longer seems like the one you once knew. This anger is no longer strategic. It is no longer subtle. It erupts violent, raw, and destructive. They may drag out old secrets, the deepest wounds you once shared in trust, and use them to hurt you, not to control anymore, but to retaliate against the feeling of powerlessness eating away at them from the inside. At this stage, your own emotions are complex. A part of you may feel afraid. A part may feel hurt. But there is often another part, very clear and very alert. You see that they are no longer rational. You see the loss of control. You see that their words are no longer meant to communicate, but only to discharge an inner storm. And this realization completely changes how you see them. Carl Jung once wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house. When the ego is deeply wounded, surface layers of control collapse, and primitive reflexes rise up. The narcissist builds their entire life around an image of omnipotence, but that image has no solid foundation. When it is threatened, the response is not self-reflection, but attack, not because they are strong, but because they have no other way to cope with the internal collapse. A very typical example is when they begin to attack you personally in irrational ways, no longer talking about the specific issue, no longer talking about behavior. They aim directly at who you are. They may call you cruel, cold, ungrateful, fake. They may even rewrite the entire story to make you look like the one who caused everything. The sole goal at this point is to pull you back into reaction, because as long as you react, they can still feel they are not completely powerless. Have you ever looked at them in moments like this and thought, why does this person no longer seem like themselves? That question matters, because the answer is often this. This is the part they have always hidden. When every mask falls away, when every strategy fails, what remains is a wounded, frightened ego that knows no other response than attack. The hardest temptation at this stage is counterattack. You have reasons to fight back. You are insulted. You are misrepresented. You are attacked at your deepest wounds. But counterattacking is exactly what they are hoping for. Not because they will win, but because it gives them the feeling that a battle still exists. And as long as there is a battle, they do not have to face the truth that they have lost power. The only solution here is not to be stronger than them, but to stand still in clarity. Not retaliating does not mean accepting. It means you are no longer participating in a game where the rules are constantly rewritten to serve a collapsing ego. Maintaining safe distance both emotionally and in reality is the only way to avoid being pulled into that primitive rage. Eventually, when the anger is exhausted and still fails to pull you back, the narcissist often retreats. This retreat can take many forms: disappearing, cutting off contact, or constructing a new story in which they are the one who chose to leave. But whatever the outward narrative, the inner truth remains unchanged. They have experienced an unforgettable moment, the moment they realized they are not omnipotent. That is why they regret it, not because they lost you, but because you became living proof of their limits. You showed them what they least wanted to see, that there are people who cannot be subdued, and your calm, throughout this entire process, becomes the boundary they will never be able to cross. 8. Regret, because they are completely forgotten. Being hated still means existing. Being forgotten means disappearing. It sounds simple, but for a narcissist, this is the most brutal truth they never want to face. Being criticized, opposed, even despised, all of that still gives them something deeply familiar: attention. As long as they are mentioned, talked about, reacted to, they still exist in someone else's emotional world. But when you no longer talk about them, no longer mention them, no longer use them as a reference point for any emotion in your inner life, then for them, this is not an ordinary loss. It is erasure. A narcissist does not exist the way an ordinary person exists. They do not feel their own value from the inside. They need the gaze, the reactions, the attention of others to confirm that they are real. That is why, throughout the relationship, you may notice they are very afraid of abandonment. But what they truly fear is not losing you. What they fear is losing the audience, losing the mirror that reflects them back to themselves. When you leave in silence without explanation, without accusation, without retelling the old story to prove yourself right, something very strange happens. There is no stage anymore, no role to play, no dialogue, and when there is no one left to reflect them, they fall into a very deep void. Not ordinary sadness, but the emptiness of an identity without a core. You, on the other hand, experience something very different. Your emotions begin to shift in another direction. At first, there may be a sense of loss, a slight hollowness, because you were used to reacting, defending, tensing yourself just to survive in that relationship. But then, very slowly, very gently, something else appears: quiet. Not a dead silence, but a breathable quiet. You begin to realize you no longer have to overthink before speaking. You no longer have to guess whether the other person will be happy or angry today. You no longer have to strain yourself to keep the peace. Your energy, once drained little by little, begins to return. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." For the narcissist, the deepest loneliness does not come from having no one beside them, but from lacking a stable inner identity that can stand alone. When you are no longer there to fill that void, they are forced to face themselves, and that is what they have avoided their entire life. The psychological mechanism here is quite simple when put in everyday language. A person who does not know who they are must live through being seen by others. They need reactions to know they exist. They need to be mentioned to feel they have a place. When you no longer react, no longer mention them, no longer place them at the center of your life story, you are not doing anything to them. Yet that very thing causes them to collapse. You can often see this clearly in what they do next. When they realize you have truly moved on, they usually look for someone new, not because they have stopped loving you, but because they urgently need another source of reflection, a new person to impress, a new relationship to restore the sense of power, a new stage to continue the same old play. And if you pay attention, the script rarely changes. Only the supporting actor does. Meanwhile, you are different. You do not need to replace anyone. You do not rush to fill the space, because the space you create is not a lack, it is room. Room to breathe. Room to hear your own inner voice again. Room to remember who you were before you had to constantly react just to survive in a highly dramatic relationship. There is one very important question you can ask yourself at this stage. Does your life feel lighter without them? Not always happier. Not always more perfect, but lighter? Lighter in your thoughts. Lighter in your emotions. Lighter in the way you move through a day without carrying an invisible weight inside. If the answer is yes, then you already have the answer to every remaining doubt. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." The narcissist lives their entire life looking outward, searching for themselves in the eyes of others. When you stop providing that gaze, you are not hurting them. You are simply no longer sleeping in their dream, and your awakening is precisely what they can never reach. The solution at this stage is not about winning or losing. It is about returning to your real life, focusing on healing not to prove that you are better than them, but to truly be better than who you were yesterday. Growing not so they can see your success, but so you can feel that you are living truthfully. Reconnecting with healthy relationships, where you do not have to strain to be loved, where your presence alone is enough, without performance. And then one day, very ordinary, very everyday, you realize that you no longer think about them. You are no longer curious about what they are doing. You no longer feel the need to retell the old story to extract a lesson. You no longer feel the urge to close anything. They become a chapter that has passed, not because you tried to forget, but because your present life is full. That is when the narcissist's regret becomes most evident, not in words, not in sudden actions, but in the fact that they no longer exist in your inner world, no longer an opponent, no longer a haunting memory, no longer a painful lesson, just an old name, no longer carrying any energy. And it is also there that you understand something very important. True victory was never about defeating anyone. True victory is when you no longer need to defeat anyone at all. When you return to yourself, to a peace that needs no proof, to a self-respect that needs no audience, to an inner life that is full enough not to depend on the reflection of anyone else. Before we move on, I want you to pause for a moment, very slowly. After the 8 truths you have just gone through, perhaps you are no longer hearing this story with your ears, but with your own memories, sensations, and the times you quietly asked yourself, have I been enduring this for too long? If you feel lighter, clearer, or even slightly empty, that is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign that an inner shift has begun. And you may also notice, so I wasn't too sensitive. There was structure to all of this. From here, we will no longer talk about the narcissist. We will talk about you, about what happens after you stop playing a role, and how you step into a new territory, quieter, but far more real. When you no longer play the role of a healer for anyone. After understanding narcissism, many people fall into a new trap. A trap that sounds beautiful, kind, and very mature. I understand them, so I must be compassionate. I know they are wounded, so I can't leave them. At first glance, this looks like love, but if you look more closely, it isn't compassion. It is a form of self-binding through understanding. You are no longer blind as before. You have read, listened, and recognized narcissistic mechanisms. You understand why they manipulate, why they need control, why they refuse to face themselves, and that very understanding becomes the reason you stay. Not because you still hope they will change, but because you are afraid of becoming someone who is not compassionate enough. You fear that leaving would mean you are not deep enough, not empathetic enough, not psychologically mature enough. In that relationship, you are not just loving. You take on another role, the healer. You listen more than necessary. You give in even when right and wrong no longer matter. You explain them to other people. You search for reasons to justify behaviors that hurt you. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it. They're just in pain. If I'm patient enough, they'll be different. But over time, you begin to feel exhausted in a very quiet way. Not sharp pain, but moral fatigue. You are no longer angry. You are simply too tired to keep holding yourself together. The danger is this: you don't see yourself as being hurt. You see yourself as sacrificing. And that very sense of sacrifice makes it harder to leave than any emotional dependency you had before. You are not afraid of losing them. You are afraid of losing the image of yourself as someone who knows how to love correctly. Carl Jung touched directly on this mechanism when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. When someone does not dare to face themselves, they will look for another person to carry that part for them." Highly empathetic people easily become containers for inner parts the other person refuses to look at. You are not only listening to their pain, you are living the inner life they refuse to live. And the better you play that role, the less reason they have to grow up. At some point, you begin to change very subtly. You no longer text to check in when they are sad. You no longer step in to explain them. You no longer look for reasons to excuse the moments when you are hurt. And strangely, you don't feel lighter because you won. You feel lighter because you have returned a burden that was never yours. But alongside that lightness comes a deep sense of guilt. Guilt for not saving them. Guilt for not staying. Guilt because, for the first time, you choose yourself without adding an apology. Have you ever realized that you weren't tired because you loved, but because you held yourself together for too long in the role of the reasonable one? That you didn't hurt because you lost them, but because you finally had to admit that you had been living a life that was never yours to live? The solution here is not cutting off, not confronting, and certainly not making moral declarations. It requires something very simple, yet very difficult: refusing the role of rescuer. No fixing, no advising, no carrying their emotional responsibility anymore. Everyone has the right to face their own darkness, and you have the right not to stand in front of it for them. When you stop being the reluctant healer, the narcissist doesn't just lose power, they lose the mirror they use to avoid themselves. And you, for the first time, stand upright in your own life, not above anyone, simply no longer bent over, carrying a life that refuses to walk on its own. When you choose a life without drama, after leaving turbulent relationships, many people fall into a state that is hard to name. There is no longer intense pain, no more anger erupting in the middle of the night, no more cycles of breaking up, getting back together, hoping, and collapsing. But in their place comes a very strange silence. Not exactly sadness, not quite happiness either, just emptiness. And if no one warns you about this beforehand, you may easily think that you are missing something, that this new life feels too bland, not stimulating enough, no peaks to cling to, no drama to make you feel like you are alive. This is the stage where many people awaken but not deeply yet. They are calm, but they do not yet know how to be at ease with themselves. They know how to avoid narcissism, how to recognize manipulation, but they do not yet know how to live a healthy life when they no longer have to react constantly. You have stepped out of the storm, but you are not yet familiar with the solid ground beneath your feet. What you need to understand very clearly is this: if you lived in drama for a long time, normal life will not feel right at first. Your nervous system has adapted to tension, to always having something to fix, to constantly being on guard, reading signals, guessing other people's moods. When all of that disappears, your brain asks, "So what is there to do now?" And if you are not careful, you will unconsciously seek drama again, not because you want to suffer, but because you are not yet used to peace. Peace at first feels very flat. It does not produce strong dopamine hits. There are no messages that make your heart race, no arguments followed by intense reconciliations, no feeling of, "I matter," because someone is reacting strongly to me. There are only quiet evenings, days that pass without incident, conversations that do not require winning or losing. And that is exactly what makes many people uneasy. They mistake the absence of drama for the absence of meaning. But pay attention to the very small changes. You begin to sleep more deeply. You no longer jolt awake because of late-night messages. You no longer perform in conversations. You do not have to plan your words in advance to avoid upsetting someone. You do not need to over-explain your choices. And most importantly, you no longer need to be understood in order to feel that you exist. These things are not loud, but they are real. Carl Jung described this as returning to life from an inner axis, a core stage of psychological maturation. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. When you were living in drama, you did not have to face yourself. All your energy was directed outward, managing other people, reacting to circumstances, enduring, in order to keep relationships intact. But when life quiets down, you begin to face a much harder question. Who am I when I no longer have to react?" This is exactly when many people feel empty, not because the new life lacks value, but because they have never lived from the inside before. They were very good at living for others, for relationships, for the role of being the understanding one, but they had never lived for the true rhythm of themselves. And this stage does not require you to do more. It requires you to get used to it. Getting used to mornings where you do not immediately check your phone. Getting used to not having someone to worry about. Getting used to not needing to prove that you are right. Getting used to normalcy, something deeply unfamiliar to those who once lived in emotional chaos. At first, you may feel bored, but if you do not run away, if you do not rush to fill that space with a new relationship or new drama, you will begin to hear very quiet voices within yourself. You start to discover what you like when you are not accommodating anyone. You begin to see your natural boundaries clearly. You know when to stop, not because you fear losing someone, but because you respect your own rhythm. You no longer seek intense emotions to feel alive. You live because you are present. This is not a noble or enlightened life. It is very ordinary, very simple, but very solid. And most importantly, it does not need an audience. When you live from your inner axis, you do not need someone else's reaction to confirm your existence. You do not need to be chosen, pursued, or held onto to feel valuable. That value no longer comes from the outside. If you are in this stage and everything feels flatter than before, remember this: you have not lost depth. You are changing the scale of measurement, from intensity to stability, from drama to presence, from living to react to living to feel. And that is not a step backward. It is the first time you are truly stepping into your own life. By the time you reach this point, you may have realized something deeply important. What makes a narcissist regret is not that you fought back better, sharper, or stronger than they did. It is that you stopped playing the game. You no longer reacted in the ways they needed, no longer carried the inner parts they were avoiding, no longer lived to be understood, validated, or to save anyone else. The 8 truths you have just walked through are not meant to label someone as a narcissist. They are meant to bring you back to yourself, to the places where you once felt exhausted, where you strained to keep the peace, where you apologized for things that were never your fault, where you stayed far too long simply because you believed, "I understand, so I must endure." And little by little, you began to draw your energy back to your own center. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Returning to your true self does not mean becoming colder or more closed off. It means becoming a person who lives from an inner axis, who no longer needs drama to feel alive, who no longer needs conflict to feel valuable. If, while listening, there was a moment when you felt personally called out, trust that it was not a coincidence. It was the deepest part of you knocking, reminding you that peace is not the absence of emotion, but the moment when emotion no longer controls you. Before you leave, I want to ask you this. Among these 8 truths, which one touched you the most? Where are you now on your journey back to yourself? If this content helped you see more clearly, please like, subscribe, and follow the channel so we can continue these deeper conversations that are not loud or sensational, but real enough that you no longer have to lose yourself again.